Picture this. You're 2 hours into a long drive with your family. The music is low, the kids are finally quiet, and everything feels fine. You've got your legally owned handgun with you the same way you carry it every single day back home. Then you see the lights. A state trooper is pulling you over for a minor rolling stop at a rural intersection. The officer steps out of the cruiser and starts walking toward your window. And right in that moment, your stomach drops. You crossed a state line about 40 miles back, and you suddenly have no idea if carrying the way you are right now is even legal here. You don't know if you're required to say something first. You don't know the storage rules in this state. And the officer is about 20 feet away and closing. That kind of gap doesn't announce itself ahead of time. It appears in real time, in the worst possible moment. This video is going to close that gap. We're going to walk through how gun laws actually work in the situations you're most likely to face. Traffic stops, interstate travel, police interactions, and your rights in states you've never been to. This isn't political debate. It's practical information that gun owners genuinely need. If that sounds like what you're looking for, this channel is worth your time. The kind of knowledge you're about to build is the kind you want in your back pocket before something happens, not after. The single biggest misconception most gun owners carry around is that the Second Amendment works the same way everywhere in America. People hear constitutional right, and they picture a uniform set of rules that applies from coast to coast, like a federal speed limit on every road. That's not how it works. The Second Amendment is a federal protection. It creates a floor, but every state is free to build its own set of rules on top of that floor, and some states have built quite a lot on top of it. The result is a country where your gun rights can look dramatically different depending on which side of a state line you happen to be standing on. Here's a way to picture it more clearly. The Second Amendment is like a nationwide rule that says every citizen has the right to own and operate a car. That right exists everywhere. But each state still sets its own speed limits, its own licensing requirements, and its own rules about where you're allowed to drive. Nobody argues that state-level traffic laws take away your right to own a car. The same logic applies to firearms. Your right to own and carry a gun is protected at the federal level. But the specific details of how you exercise that right, where you can carry, what kind of permit you need, how the gun must be stored in your vehicle, those details belong to the states. The difference between states can be genuinely startling once you start looking. In some states, anyone who can legally own a firearm can carry it without ever going through a formal permit process at all. That's called permitless carry, and it exists in a growing number of states. In other states, you have to complete a background check, sit through a required training course, and wait through a mandatory waiting period before a permit is issued. Some states recognize carry permits from other states the way they recognize out-of-state driver's licenses. Other states don't recognize out-of-state permits at all, full stop. You could be doing everything right at home and unknowingly step into a violation the moment you cross certain borders. Most gun owners build their understanding of the law around what's allowed where they live. That's the right instinct, but it creates a blind spot when they travel. The moment you leave your home state with a firearm, you're operating in a new legal environment, and your existing knowledge may not transfer. Your permit may not be valid. The way you're storing the gun in your vehicle may not be legal. The places you're allowed to carry may be completely different, and the law doesn't give you credit for acting in good faith. You're either in compliance or you're not, regardless of your intentions. This is where the gap between how people imagine gun rights and how those rights actually function in daily life becomes the most visible. In the version most people carry in their heads, the Second Amendment is clean and simple. It's a constitutional protection that means the government can't interfere with your right to own and carry a firearm. That's true as a principle, but in practice, that right is surrounded by a web of details, waiting periods before a purchase clears, permit requirements that vary by state, specific places where carry is prohibited no matter what your permit says, storage requirements when children are present in the home, red flag laws in some states, which allow a court to temporarily remove firearms from a person's possession under certain legal circumstances. Both versions of gun rights exist at the same time. The principle is your foundation. The practice is what you actually have to live inside of. Think about the moments where this plays out in real life. A traffic stop in a state you've driven through 100 times but never thought about legally. A weekend road trip that crosses 3 different legal environments in 2 days. A visit to a building you've been to before, not knowing the management changed the policy on firearms. A conversation with a law enforcement officer where you're not sure what the law requires you to say. None of these are unusual situations. They happen to ordinary gun owners all the time, and what you know in those moments shapes everything that follows. For much of American legal history, the framework around gun rights was fragmented and inconsistent. Courts in different parts of the country applied different standards when measuring whether a gun law was constitutional. Some read the Second Amendment narrowly, as if it mainly applied to firearms in the context of organized military service. Others interpreted it broadly as a personal right. That inconsistency made it genuinely difficult to know what your rights really meant in a specific courthouse or jurisdiction. The legal ground felt different depending on where you were standing. That started to change in a meaningful way in the mid-2000s. The biggest shift came in 2008. The Supreme Court took up a case challenging Washington, D.C.'s near-total ban on handguns in the home. In what became known as District of Columbia versus Heller, the court ruled 5-4 that the Second Amendment protects an individual's right to keep a firearm at home for self-defense. That ruling was significant in a way that's easy to understate. Before Heller, courts could legitimately argue that the Second Amendment only protected gun ownership in a collective, militia-related context. After Heller, that argument was closed. Individual ownership for self-defense was now constitutionally protected at the federal level. But Heller still left a question open. The case had involved a law in Washington, D.C., which operates under federal jurisdiction. The ruling didn't directly address what state and local governments could do. 2 years later, the Supreme Court closed that gap in a case called McDonald versus City of Chicago. The court held that the Second Amendment applies to state and local governments, not just federal laws and territories. That meant cities and states couldn't simply opt out of the individual right confirmed in Heller by passing their own local bans. The protection became national. Every government in the country was bound by it. Even after Heller and McDonald, though, a serious problem remained. Courts still couldn't agree on what standard to apply when deciding whether a specific gun law went too far. Some courts used a two-step test that weighed the government's stated interest against how much the law burdened gun rights. Other circuits used different approaches entirely. A gun law that survived a legal challenge in one part of the country might have been struck down under a different test somewhere else. That inconsistency held for more than a decade, leaving gun owners, legislators, and lower court judges without a clear and consistent measuring stick. That changed in 2022 with the Supreme Court's ruling in New York State Rifle and Pistol Association versus Bruin. New York had a law that required people to demonstrate a specific personal need beyond general self-defense in order to receive a permit to carry a firearm in public. The court struck that law down 5-4 and established a new framework in the process. Going forward, courts must evaluate gun laws by asking whether they fit within America's historical tradition of firearm regulation. The question shifted from whether the government had a compelling enough reason for a law to whether that type of law has roots in the country's legal history. That change in framework sent ripples across every gun-related case already working through the courts. What Bruin did in practical terms was give courts a cleaner standard, but it also opened a wave of new legal challenges to gun laws across the country. Laws about carrying in public, laws about certain types of firearms, laws about who is and isn't eligible to own a gun, all of them came under fresh scrutiny after Bruin. Some survived the new standard, others were struck down. Courts are still working through the implications, and that process is far from finished. The legal landscape for gun owners in 2026 looks different from what it looked like in 2021, and it may look different again a few years from now. This is exactly why staying informed is not optional for a responsible gun owner. Not in the sense of following every court filing as it happens, but in the basic sense of knowing when something significant changes and understanding what it means for your day-to-day life. The gun owners who tend to get into legal trouble aren't usually reckless people. They're often careful, well-intentioned people who were operating on information that was no longer current or that never applied to the state they were in. The law doesn't make allowances for that. Knowing where the lines are is your responsibility as an owner, not the state's responsibility to remind you. If you've made it this far into the video, you're the kind of person this channel was built for. You're not here looking for outrage or entertainment. You want to actually understand how the law works in the real world. That's the conversation we try to have here, and it's not one you find everywhere. If you want to be part of a community that takes this seriously and keeps these conversations going, joining the channel is the most straightforward way to do that. There's more content like this coming, and it's worth being here for it. Now let's get into the specific situations that trip people up, because understanding big court decisions is useful, but knowing what to do in the parking lot or at the traffic stop is what actually matters. Traveling across state lines with a firearm is one of the most legally complicated things a gun owner does regularly, and most people who do it have never sat down and thought through the full picture. There is a federal provision that offers some protection for this kind of travel. It comes from a law called the Firearm Owners Protection Act, passed in 1986. The provision says that if you're legally allowed to possess a firearm in the state you're departing from, and legally allowed to possess it in the state you're heading to, you can transport it through states in between, as long as the gun is unloaded and secured in a locked case that isn't directly accessible from the passenger compartment of the vehicle. This is often referred to as the safe passage provision. The critical word in that protection is transport. It doesn't mean you can stop for a 3-day visit in a state with strict gun laws and be covered. Courts have consistently interpreted this provision as applying to direct, continuous travel. If you make a significant detour, stay overnight, or spend extended time in a state that would otherwise prohibit what you're carrying, the protection starts to fall apart. It was designed for the person passing through on the way from point A to point B, not for someone making stops along the route. If your trip includes overnight stays in states with restrictive gun laws, you need to look up those states' laws specifically before you leave home. Vehicles deserve their own conversation because every state treats them differently. Some states view a vehicle as an extension of the home, which typically means more permissive rules about how and where a firearm can be stored inside it. Other states treat the inside of a car more like a public space, which means stricter requirements apply. The questions that matter most are whether the firearm needs to be unloaded, whether it needs to be in a specific type of locked container, whether the ammunition has to be stored separately, and whether your permit, if you have one, allows you to keep a loaded firearm accessible while driving. Each of those answers can be different depending on the state you're in, and a wrong answer on any one of them can create real legal exposure. Private property is another area where gun owners regularly make assumptions that turn out to be wrong. There's a meaningful difference between a place that's open to the public and a place that's publicly owned. A grocery store, a restaurant, a movie theater, or a private parking lot might be open for anyone to walk into, but it's private property. The owner gets to decide whether firearms are permitted on the premises. Some states give property owners explicit legal authority to ban firearms and attach legal consequences to violations of that policy. If a business or property owner posts a no firearms sign and you carry there anyway, the legal exposure can range from being asked to leave to a criminal charge depending on your state's specific rules. Government-owned spaces carry their own set of restrictions layered on top of everything else. Federal buildings are almost universally off-limits. Schools and the areas immediately surrounding them fall under the Gun-Free School Zones Act, a federal law with serious penalties that apply regardless of what state you're in. Courthouses, polling locations, and secure government facilities carry similar prohibitions under most state laws. State-level restrictions often go further. Certain hospitals, establishments where alcohol is the primary business, public transportation, and in some states, places of worship. The combined list of places where your carry permit simply doesn't apply is longer than most gun owners have ever thought about, and discovering that list during an incident is the worst possible way to learn it. Law enforcement encounters are where everything we've talked about so far converges into a single real moment. If you're carrying a firearm when a police officer approaches you, the first 30 seconds matter enormously. Some states have what's called a duty to inform, which means you're legally required to tell the officer that you have a firearm on your person without waiting to be asked. Other states have no such requirement, meaning you're only obligated to answer if the officer specifically asks. This is a detail that varies by state, and if you're traveling, the rule in the state you're currently in is the one that applies, not the rule back home. Knowing which framework you're operating under is essential before you ever find yourself in that situation. Regardless of what the law requires, the practical approach is always the same. Keep your hands visible. Move slowly and deliberately. Do not reach toward the firearm or anywhere near it without first telling the officer exactly what you're doing and why. A simple statement like, "Officer, I'm carrying a firearm and I need to reach into the glove compartment for my registration," gives the officer the information they need and signals that you're cooperative and transparent. Most law enforcement officers encounter armed citizens regularly and handle it without any issue when those citizens behave calmly and clearly. The combination of knowing the law and staying composed is what keeps these encounters routine. There's a layer of legal protection that most gun owners benefit from without fully understanding it. Federal law provides manufacturers and licensed dealers with protection against civil lawsuits when a criminal uses one of their products to commit violence. The reasoning behind that protection is direct and sensible. A manufacturer that follows every federal requirement, runs every required background check, keeps every required record, and sells only to legally eligible buyers did nothing wrong. Holding that company liable for what a criminal independently decides to do with a lawfully purchased product would punish the entire legal firearms industry for the behavior of people it had no control over. Courts have consistently upheld that protection when it's been challenged, and it matters for every gun owner who participates in the legal firearms market. The reason that protection matters to you personally is that it keeps the legal market functioning. When manufacturers and dealers are protected from liability for independent criminal misuse, they can operate without the threat of lawsuits designed not to win compensation, but to impose costs severe enough to drive them out of business. That stability shows up in competitive pricing, consistent product availability, and a functioning market that law-abiding gun owners depend on every time they make a purchase. Anytime that protection is weakened or challenged, the downstream effect reaches the consumer. Legal protections for the industry and legal rights for individual owners are part of the same connected system. One area that consistently doesn't get the attention it deserves is what happens when a gun owner relocates to a new state. The legal framework you've been living under doesn't follow you when you move. Your carry permit may not be valid in your new home state. Some states require new residents to register their firearms within a defined window after establishing residency, and failing to meet that deadline isn't treated as a paperwork oversight. In some jurisdictions, it's treated as a criminal violation. Beyond that, certain firearms that were entirely legal in your previous state may be restricted or require additional permits under your new state's laws. If you're planning a move and you own firearms, researching your destination state's laws before the moving truck arrives is one of the more important things you can do to protect yourself legally. The legal environment inside a single state also shifts over time. New laws get passed. Court rulings change what's enforceable. Regulations are updated and expanded. A magazine capacity that was unrestricted when you originally bought it could fall under new limits after a legislative session. A permit that was valid last year might have new training requirements attached to it this year. Some new laws include grace periods that give existing gun owners time to come into compliance. Others take effect immediately with no transition period. The only reliable defense against being blindsided by a change in the law is staying current on what your state is doing. That's not a burden unique to gun ownership. It's just what responsible ownership actually looks like in practice. And on the subject of things that are easy to overlook, if your firearm is ever stolen, report it to law enforcement right away. Some states legally require this, but even where it's not required, reporting a theft protects you. If that firearm later shows up at a crime scene, and your name is attached to it through the chain of ownership, a police report filed promptly after the theft creates a clear record that the gun left your control without your knowledge or consent. Without that report, explaining the connection becomes significantly harder, and the legal exposure becomes significantly greater. Reporting immediately is a small step that can prevent a situation you had nothing to do with from becoming a serious legal problem. Let's pull all of this together. The Second Amendment is a real constitutionally affirmed right. Major court decisions have reinforced that over the past 20 years and continue to shape what that right means in practice. But the right alone doesn't protect you in every situation. What protects you is understanding how that right operates in the specific environment you're in. Whether that's your home state, a state you're traveling through, a parking lot, a vehicle, or a conversation with a law enforcement officer. The gap between having the right and exercising it safely and legally is filled with details. Learning those details is the practical work of responsible ownership. The gun owners who end up in legal trouble usually didn't intend to break any rules. They made assumptions. They assumed their permit was valid somewhere it wasn't. They assumed a place was public property when it wasn't. They assumed the law hadn't changed. Assumptions are expensive when the law is involved. The good news is that closing those gaps doesn't require a law degree. It requires the same kind of disciplined attention that careful, responsible gun owners already apply to how they handle and store their firearms. Apply that same attention to the legal side of ownership, and you're in a very strong position. Here's something worth thinking about before you close this video. Every future situation where your firearm is part of the picture, whether that's a traffic stop, a move to a new state, a question about where you can and can't carry, or just a conversation with someone who doesn't understand the law the way you do now, every one of those moments will be shaped by what you know. Building that knowledge consistently, keeping it current, adding to it over time, that's what puts you in control of those moments instead of hoping for the best. This channel publishes content specifically designed to do that for you. Subscribing means the next useful piece of information reaches you before you're standing in the middle of a situation where you need it. The Second Amendment isn't going anywhere. The courts have been clear and consistent about that. But rights don't manage themselves, and they don't protect people who don't understand them. The details matter. The state lines matter. The specific rules for your vehicle, your carry situation, and your conversations with law enforcement matter. Stay informed on those details. Handle every situation with the preparation and calm that comes from actually knowing the law. That's what it looks like to be a responsible gun owner in the practical day-to-day sense of the word, and that standard is worth holding yourself to.